what Module 2 actually is all about. Before I get started though, I do want to make one clarification. I had a question as I sat down. We did not poach George from Erie. When I said he was at Erie and now he's full-time with us, he'd finished up there and he'd become available, and we capitalised on that opportunity that was there in front of us, so just to make that clear. All right, so breeding schemes. So optimisation of breeding schemes, it's about acknowledging that breeding is so complex that no program is ever truly 100% optimised. And when we're talking about optimisation, we're talking about manipulation of the breeder's equation, and I probably should have put it up there, but I'm sure you're familiar with it, that you've got your selection intensity, your selection accuracy, you've got your genetic variation, and how you put that together over a period of time is what drives your rate of genetic gain. And if you pull on any one of those levers to increase your selection accuracy, you normally have to make compromises elsewhere. So it's about looking at those trade-offs to do an analysis on where different decisions could be made to arrive at a higher rate of genetic gain. And we'll provide some examples. I'll provide some examples later this afternoon. But yeah, there are dozens of decisions that breeders need to make, from crossing through to the final selections of the end products. And each of these decisions have potentially up to hundreds of options. So the number of combinations of ways in which these things can be done are huge, and so it really is difficult to optimise. And in Excellence in Breeding, we're talking about making new tools and services available. Those tools are not going to have impact if they're not applied in a strategic way that aligns with the rest of the breeding pipeline. So the ways in which we look at this are optimisation under the status quo. So if everything stays the same, if all your resources are the same and the availability to tools and services remain the same, are there things that can be done to achieve the products that George is talking about under the product profiles, acknowledging that is the target. And you know, if you're training to beat France in the football, then that's your product. Let's put a strategy. George said you don't just train for the sake of it, you're training strategically to beat that team. This is about putting a breeding strategy in place to develop that product. Which you're doing, of course. You've got a strategy, but it's about looking at it for opportunities. So the next part is strategic response to change in resources. So if you have resources, if you have a reduction in resources, then you need to respond strategically to that. Do you just if you have a 30% reduction, do you do 30% less of everything, or do you maintain your core activities as they currently are and cut other things more drastically, which is normally the best way to go. You just need to, but obviously the decisions need to be made as to what falls into each category. As access to new tools and services become available, like I said, if you've never used marker-assisted selection before, but now you have that's available to you, how do you integrate it into the breeding pipeline so that it has maximum impact? And change in breeding objectives. It could be a whole range of reasons why your objectives might change. It could be a new disease, it could be a new market class you're breeding for, a new geography you're breeding for. It could be through social responsibility. It could be that suddenly it's been decided at a strategic level that biofortification might be important, where it might not have been happening before. To integrate these new objectives into the breeding pipeline need to be done in a strategic way. And lastly, we're looking at developing decision support and optimisation tools to help game out these decisions, to help make better decisions. So there are different ways in which we'll, at one level, we're wanting to develop quite basic tools that just help with parental choice and cross combinations and deciding on population size. But we're also ultimately, in the longer term, wanting to develop more complex tools so that you can put in all your variables of your breeding program, your costs of screening and your heritabilities and what sites you're using and what the correlations are between these sites. You can put all the variables in, and this is the ambition, to be able to put in, what if I made a different decision here? What are the knock-on effects and what's the end outcome? they're the sorts of tools that we're wanting to work with you to develop so that you can have better decision support. So within each of our modules, like I mentioned earlier, has a core areas of which it'll focus on, or what we're calling the big topics for the module. For module 2, it is looking at predictive tools and doing a cost-benefit analysis on these, and to see how they can be most strategically applied to the breeding pipeline for the maximum impact. And when we're talking predictive tools, we can break that up into genomic tools and phenotypic tools. Pardon me. So genomic tools are forward marker selection and genomic selection, and for phenotypic traits, if we're talking predictive tools, we're talking about indirect selection, or selection for secondary traits. Traits that are not necessarily, might not appear on the product list of traits on a product profile, but they're correlated, and sometimes it can provide value to select for these traits indirectly through a secondary trait, other times not so much, where we want to address when it makes sense to do it and then how you'd integrate that into the pipeline. Integrating trait pipelines with core breeding, or another way of thinking about this might be pre-breeding with core breeding. And acknowledging that they're two very separate activities and how to get the most from each of these activities. And lastly, like I mentioned, it's just simply optimising programs, like I mentioned, and simulating alternative breeding schemes, both in a very basic way where it might be obvious in some situations, particularly in light of a product profile. If you've got that, once you've got that clear target in mind, you might look at your strategy and say, well, what I'm doing here might not make so much sense. Maybe I'll just change this decision to a different one. I mean, that's an example of a quick win, but also more complex examples as well, which we might need those tools for. So I don't think I'll go into too much detail. I'll try and go through this pretty quickly. So the first one, predictive tools. I mean, to understand a cost-benefit analysis, we need to understand what are the numbers that need to be processed in this analysis. We need to understand the heritability and reliability, the correlation with the primary trait. What's the genetic versus phenotypic correlations? It's one thing for a secondary trait to have a phenotypic correlation, but how much of that is genetic? What's the percent variance explained? And in this area, to develop tools and support breeding programs to make these trade-off analyses. Trait pipelines and core breeding, really, like I said before, the main message here is that we're wanting to acknowledge that these are distinct activities and they've got distinct and separate objectives, and understanding what these are helps to put a robust strategy in place. And lastly, improved decision support. Like I said, going for the quick wins, but then also looking for decision support tools, again, sort of a more basic version, and then but also in the longer term developing a more sophisticated version. So that's the high level summary of what Module 2 is setting out to achieve. I'm going to explain later this afternoon a bit more detail as to exactly how we plan to, or some of the things that we hope to be addressing in these areas in Module 2. But for now, I'd like to pass over to Mike Olsen, who can give a description of what Module 3 is looking at. And I'll be back soon for a very quick description of Module 4 and 5, which I'll be giving for the module leaders which aren't present here today for those modules. Thanks, Mike.